In the final moments before death, 3 men stood before the golden throne and made a promise that would echo across 10,000 years. They swore an oath not to the Imperium, not to humanity, but to a corpse that dreamed of godhood. And in that moment, something that should never have existed was born from necessity and desperation. A conspiracy woven into the very fabric of the Imperium itself, so deeply buried that even the Inquisition dare not speak its name aloud. They are the architects of resurrection, the keepers of a terrible truth, and they move through the halls of terror like ghosts wearing the faces of saints. The chapter master's hand trembled as he placed the gene seed vial upon the altar of black stone. Around him, the chamber breathed with a darkness that predated the Imperium, predated even the age of strife. 12 figures stood in a circle, their faces hidden behind masks of gold and silver, each representing a facet of the Imperium's power that should never have aligned. An Inquisitor Lord whose seal could condemn worlds, a Cardinal whose sermons moved billions to ecstasy or war, a Fabricator General whose forges churned out the weapons of genocide, a rogue trader whose wealth could buy dynasties, a High Lord whose signature held the weight of law, a Space Marine chapter master who commanded angels of death, a navigator whose bloodline had guided ships since before the Emperor walked, an astropath whose mind touched the warp itself, a sister of silence whose very presence was absence, a custodian guard who had stood watch for millennia, an officio assassinorum master whose killers were ghosts given form. And seated at the circle's heart, hooded in shadow so complete that light itself seemed to flee from him, the architect of this blasphemy or salvation, no one could truly say which. They called themselves the Illuminati, and they believed they alone could save humanity from its slow extinction by doing the impossible, bringing back the Emperor not as the corpse god worshipped by trillions, but as something reborn, something terrible and pure. The gene seed began to glow with an inner light that should not exist, for it had been touched by something beyond mortal comprehension. The chapter master spoke in a voice laden with centuries of burden, recounting how his battle brothers had discovered this artifact on a forgotten world where the Emperor himself had once walked during the Great Crusade. The planet's name had been struck from all records, its coordinates erased, its very existence denied by every archive in the Imperium. Yet they had found it in the warp-tainted prophecies of a mad saint, in the fever dreams of a dying librarian, in the geometric patterns of stellar drift that could not be coincidence. What they discovered there defied understanding. A temple not built by human hands, filled with machinery that predated the dark age of technology, and at its center, a stasis field containing a single genetic sample sealed in a container bearing the aquila and a designation number that matched nothing in Imperial records. The gene seed had been created during the Emperor's earliest experiments, before even the Primarchs, before the Thunder Warriors, when he first began to reshape humanity into something that could survive the galaxy's horrors. It contained potential that had been deemed too dangerous, too volatile, too divine for mortal vessels. But the Illuminati believed it held the key to creating a new vessel for the Emperor's soul, a perfect human unsullied by chaos, whose body could house divinity without shattering under the weight of godhood. The Inquisitor Lord stepped forward, his augmetic eye whirring as it focused on the vial with instruments that could perceive the immaterium itself. He spoke of the Sensei, those rare souls born of the Emperor's bloodline scattered across the galaxy, children he never acknowledged, wandering the Imperium ignorant of their divine heritage. The Illuminati had spent millennia searching for them, tracking bloodlines through centuries of genealogical records, following whispers and rumors and the rare psychic echoes that marked their passing. Each Sensei possessed a fragment of the Emperor's essence, a spark of his immortal soul that made them invisible to chaos, immune to corruption, eternal unless killed by violence. But they were not enough alone. The Illuminati's plan required sacrifice on a scale that would make even the Inquisition recoil in horror. They would gather the Sensei, bring them before the Golden Throne, and in a ritual of annihilation, merge their souls with the Emperor's own, feeding his dying consciousness with the very essence of his scattered children. The psychic conflagration would be catastrophic, a scream in the warp that would shake the pillars of reality itself. And in that moment of cosmic agony, as the Emperor's soul consumed his own progeny, they would transfer his consciousness into the new vessel grown from this ancient gene seed, a body perfected by science and ritual, uncorrupted and young and burning with the power that had once unified humanity under a golden age. But the Cardinal raised his hand, and the temperature in the chamber plummeted until frost formed on the ancient stones. He spoke of the faith, the vast machinery of the ecclesiarchy that had been built upon the corpse god's worship, the trillions who prayed daily to the Emperor as a deity despite his own rejection of such veneration. If he returned as a man, if he walked among humanity again speaking the imperial truth that denied the gods, what would happen to the faith that held the Imperium together? The zealotry, the martyrdom, the blessed insanity that drove men to die screaming his name while charging into certain death, all of it would crumble. The Imperium's greatest strength was also its greatest weakness. It had become a theocracy built upon the denial of a god who had become divine in all but admission. The Cardinal's voice dripped with bitter irony as he described how the Emperor's own atheistic vision had been perverted into the most fanatical religion the galaxy had ever known. And yet that religion was the only thing preventing humanity from fracturing into a million warring factions. The Illuminati's plan was not just resurrection, it was revolution, a complete restructuring of imperial society that would either save humanity or shatter it beyond all hope of recovery. The Fabricator General's binary cant filled the chamber with clicking harmonics that translated into terrible logic. He presented data streams showing the Golden Throne's decay, the Emperor's slow decline into true death. The Adeptus Mechanicus had calculated the endpoint. Within centuries, perhaps less, the arcane machinery would fail despite all their prayers and repairs. When that happened, the Astronomicon would die, plunging the Imperium into isolation and darkness as worlds lost their ability to navigate the warp. Humanity would be severed from itself, each system becoming an island in a hostile void, easy prey for the Xenos and Chaos forces that circled like sharks scenting blood. The throne's failure would also unleash the Emperor's psychic death scream, a warp storm of such magnitude that it could tear Terra itself apart, potentially birthing a new Eye of Terror at the very heart of the Imperium. The Illuminati's plan, for all its apparent blasphemy, was born from mathematical certainty. Do nothing and humanity dies slowly, strangled by its own decay, or act and perhaps, just perhaps, give the species one final chance at the dominion the Emperor had promised. The Fabricator General's logic was cold and pure, but in the quantum pattern of his thought engines, there flickered something that might have been doubt or fear or the machine spirit equivalent of prayer. The Sister of Silence moved through the circle like a void in reality itself, her presence suppressing even the whisper of the warp that permeated all space. She carried a data slate containing names, hundreds of thousands of names, each one a Sensei identified across the breadth of the Imperium. Some lived as merchants and farmers, unaware of their heritage. Others had become warriors or explorers, drawn by instincts they could not name toward the galaxy's dangers. A few had even joined the Imperial institutions, their psychic immunity and subtle charisma marking them as exceptional even among the Imperium's elite. The Illuminati had agents everywhere, watching, protecting, guiding these precious souls toward Terra when the time came. But the Sisters' report was grim. Chaos had learned of the Sensei. Cults dedicated to the ruinous powers now hunted them specifically, recognizing them as threats to the gods' ultimate victory. The Inquisition, too, had begun to notice patterns, asking questions that came dangerously close to the truth. Time was running out, not just for the Emperor, but for the conspiracy itself. The longer they waited, the more likely their plan would be discovered and crushed by those too short-sighted or too fanatical to see its necessity. The hooded figure at the circle's center finally spoke, and his voice carried the weight of eons. He revealed himself as one of the original perpetuals, those rare immortals who had walked beside the Emperor during humanity's earliest days. He had been there when the Emperor made his bargain with the Chaos Gods on Molech, had witnessed the birth of the Primarchs, had stood in the throne room when Horus struck down his father. He spoke of the Emperor's greatest secret, that he had always known this day would come, that his death upon the Golden Throne was not defeat but transformation, a necessary crucible to burn away his humanity and emerge as something pure and terrible. The Illuminati were not conspirators working against the Emperor's will. They were the fulfillment of a plan 10,000 years in the making, agents placed by the Emperor himself before he ascended the throne, given knowledge and resources to execute a resurrection he could not accomplish alone. This perpetual, this ancient being whose name had been lost to time, was the keeper of the Emperor's final testament, a psychic instruction encoded in his dying thoughts that only one with both immortality and unshakable faith could preserve through the long centuries of waiting. Yet even as he spoke these words of cosmic purpose, the chamber's walls began to weep blood. The astropath screamed as visions flooded her mind, black ships burning in the void, Sensei dying by the thousands as chaos forces fell upon them with unprecedented coordination, and a laughter that came from something watching from beyond the veil of reality. The ruinous gods knew, perhaps they had always known, had allowed the Illuminati to gather their pieces and plot their resurrection, because it served some darker purpose in the eternal game of divinity. The gene seed upon the altar began to crack, hairline fractures spreading across its surface, as something tried to corrupt it from within, to poison the very foundation of their plan. The Custodian Guard moved with impossible speed, surrounding the altar with his guardian spear raised, but he knew, as they all knew, that if chaos truly opposed them, no force in the materium could guarantee success. The Illuminati stood at the precipice of revelation or damnation, their conspiracy exposed by forces beyond their comprehension, and the question that would determine humanity's fate was no longer whether they could resurrect the Emperor, but whether they would be allowed to try. In the darkness above Terra, something laughed with 4 voices at once, and across the galaxy, Sensei children woke screaming from dreams of golden fire and endless hunger. The screaming echoed through every relay station across the segmentum, a psychic howl that turned astropaths into weeping statues of madness and forced navigators to claw out their own third eyes. On the shrine world of Ophelia VII, a cardinal collapsed mid-sermon, blood pouring from his mouth as he spoke in tongues that predated human language. The words translated in the minds of those faithful enough to hear. The Emperor's children were being harvested, their souls collected not by the Illuminati's careful agents, but by something else, something that moved through the Imperium, wearing the faces of saints and speaking with the authority of the ecclesiarchy itself. In the underhive of Necromunda, a Sensei merchant watched his family burn as redemptionist cultists sang hymns of purification, never knowing that the fire consuming his children was fed by orders that originated from Terra itself. On the feral world of Fenris, a young warrior who had never felt the touch of chaos died with a space wolf's blade through his heart, the chapter having received intelligence from an unnamed inquisitor that a heretic walked among their recruitment trials. Across 100 worlds, the pattern repeated, Sensen dying by fire, blade, and bolt, their immortal essence snuffed out by Imperial hands that believed they served the Emperor's will. But the Illuminati watched in horror as the psychic signatures of those deaths did not dissipate into the warp as mortal souls did. Instead, they were being drawn somewhere, collected and channeled through invisible geometries that stank of calculation and ancient malice. The Inquisitor Lord stood in his sanctum aboard the battle barge Eternal Vigil, surrounded by data streams that painted a picture of catastrophe. His network of informants, carefully cultivated over 3 centuries of service, was collapsing. Agents were being recalled by inquisitors he had never heard of, investigated on charges that appeared from sealed warrants, bearing authentications he could not verify. Someone within the Inquisition itself was moving against the Illuminati, using the organization's own paranoia and secrecy as a weapon. He traced the pattern back through decades of seemingly unrelated incidents, The sudden retirement of an inquisitor who had shown interest in perpetual mythology. The reassignment of an Ordo Xenos team that had discovered pre-Imperial artifacts. The execution of an astropath who claimed to have received messages from the Emperor's past. Each incident had appeared natural at the time, the normal churn of an institution built on suspicion and purges. But seen together, they formed the outline of a counter-conspiracy, one that had been operating in the shadows of the Illuminati's own shadow, watching and waiting for the moment to strike. The Inquisitor Lord felt something he had not experienced in centuries, genuine fear. Not for himself, death held no terror for a man who had lived as long as he had, but for the realization that their grand plan might have been compromised from its inception, that they might have been pieces in a larger game they could not perceive. On Mars, the Fabricator General descended into a forged temple that did not appear on any schematic of the Red Planet's warren of sacred manufactorums. Here, in chambers lit by plasma fires that burned with radioactive fury, the most heretical work of the Mechanicus was conducted, the construction of flesh. Clone vats stretched into darkness, each containing a body grown from the ancient gene seed, imperfect attempts at creating the vessel that would house divinity. Most had failed spectacularly, flesh melting into tumorous masses or bones, growing into impossible geometries that defied biological law. A few had survived to maturity before expiring, their cells unable to contain the psychic potential encoded in their genetics. But one, the 97th attempt, breathed with steady rhythm in its amniotic suspension. The Fabricator General ran diagnostics through direct neural interface, reading the biodata that confirmed what they had theorized but never dared hope. This body was stable, its gene structure accepting the modifications and enhancements without rejection, its nascent neural pathways showing patterns that matched the fragmentary records of the Emperor's own brain scan from before his ascension. Yet as the Fabricator General observed this miracle of dark science, he noticed something in the data that should not be there. Quantum fluctuations in the subject's cellular structure that suggested external manipulation. The body was changing on its own, evolving in directions the Mechanicus had not programmed, as if something was guiding its development from beyond the materium. The chapter master knelt in his reclusium, surrounded by the remains of his fallen brothers, their gene seed extracted and stored in stasis crypts that lined the walls like silent witnesses. His chapter, the Angels Resplendent, had served the Illuminati's cause for 6,000 years, ever since his predecessor had been initiated into the conspiracy during the Age of Apostasy. They had recovered dozens of Sensei from war zones, smuggled them to safe houses across the Imperium, fought and died to protect the Emperor's hidden children from those who would destroy them. But now the chapter master faced a crisis of faith that cut deeper than any blade. His chaplains were questioning, asking why they protected mortals who showed no psychic gifts, who appeared to be nothing more than unusually long-lived humans. The librarian had detected something wrong with the Sensei they guarded, a psychic signature that did not match Imperial records, a wrongness that tasted of deception. And yesterday, a message had arrived through channels so secure that only the High Lords themselves should have access to them. A message bearing the seal of the Captain General of the Adeptus Custodes, demanding the chapter master's immediate presence on Terra to answer charges of heresy and collusion with forces inimical to the Imperium. The Angels Resplendent stood at a precipice: obey and potentially doom the Illuminati's plan, or resist and become renegades, hunted across the stars by their own brothers. The rogue traitor Celestine Vex stood on the bridge of her flagship Dynasty's Promise, watching through the viewing port as her fleet translated from the warp above a world that did not exist on any Imperial chart. She had paid a fortune for these coordinates, extracted them from the dying mind of a chaos sorcerer her crew had captured during a raid on a word-bearer's supply convoy. The sorcerer had laughed as he died, blood frothing from his lips as he spoke of a place where the Illuminati kept their greatest treasures, where artifacts from the Emperor's own hand were stored against the day of resurrection. Celestine had brought these coordinates to her fellow conspirators, expecting gratitude, perhaps even elevation within their ranks. Instead, she had been met with horror and immediate commands to destroy the data and never speak of it again. So she had come alone, driven by a rogue trader's instinct that some truths were worth more than loyalty. What she found orbiting this nameless world froze the blood in her veins. A fleet of black ships, hundreds of them, arranged in formations that predated the Imperium's current naval doctrine. They were ancient, their hulls bearing marks that matched archaeological records from the Unification Wars. And they were active, their weapon batteries powered, their shields raised, their auger arrays sweeping space with relentless precision. This was not an Illuminati stronghold. It was a prison, or perhaps a hunting ground. And Celestine realized with dawning horror that her quest for truth had led her to something the conspiracy had been desperately trying to hide from itself. Deep within the Imperial Palace, in chambers so heavily warded that even demons feared to tread, the Custodian Guard of the Illuminati performed his sacred duty. He was one of the 10,000, those who had stood watch over the Emperor since before the Imperium began. And he had volunteered for this duty when the conspiracy first formed in the aftermath of the Heresy. His task was simple yet terrible: to observe the Emperor's slow death with eyes unclouded by faith or hope, to record every fluctuation in the Golden Throne's machinery, to note each incremental failure in the arcane systems that kept their masters suspended between life and final dissolution. For 10,000 years he had watched, and what he had witnessed would break the spirit of any lesser being. The Emperor was not merely dying, he was changing, his psychic presence growing vaster and more alien with each passing century. The man who had walked among humanity, who had unified Terra through will and vision, was being consumed by something else, something that fed on the faith of trillions and grew fat on their worship. The Custodian Guard had kept meticulous records, documentation that the Illuminati used to refine their plan of resurrection. But he had also kept a second set of records, hidden even from his fellow conspirators, notes on phenomena that defied explanation. Moments when the Emperor's vital signs showed patterns of consciousness that should be impossible for one so near death. Instances when the Golden Throne's machinery operated in ways its designers never intended. Whispers in the throne room that spoke with the Emperor's voice, but said things the Emperor would never have sanctioned. And most disturbing of all, the Custodian had begun to notice figures in the shadows of the throne room. Humanoid shapes that appeared for fractions of seconds before vanishing, their faces hidden but their posture suggesting they too were watching, waiting, recording. The Cardinal gathered his most trusted priests in the cathedral ship Lightbringer, a vessel so massive it could be mistaken for a small moon, its architecture devoted entirely to worship and war. He spoke to them of a vision that had come to him during his moment of collapse, a revelation that burned in his mind with the clarity of absolute truth. The Emperor, he claimed, did not wish to return as a man. His ascension to the Golden Throne had been intentional, a transformation from mortal to divine that he embraced despite the agony it entailed. The Imperium's faith, the trillions who prayed daily to the God Emperor, were not deluded fools, but participants in a great working, a psychic ritual that would culminate in the Emperor's full apotheosis as a true god of the warp, a fifth chaos god, but one devoted to order and humanity's survival. The Illuminati's plan, from this perspective, was not salvation but sabotage, an attempt to drag the Emperor back down to mortality when he stood on the threshold of divinity. The Cardinal's words ignited fierce debate among his priests, some crying heresy at the suggestion that chaos could produce anything but corruption, others embracing the theology with zealot fervor. But the Cardinal was not seeking consensus. He was building a faction, a counter-conspiracy within the conspiracy. And when he was finished speaking, he made them all swear an oath not to the Illuminati, not to the Imperium, but to the God Emperor's ascension, even if it meant opposing those who claimed to serve him. The Navigator Primaris of House Belisarius walked the streets of Terra's upper spires with eyes that saw beyond the material realm, tracking eddies in the warp that corresponded to movements in the city below. She had spent decades mapping the Illuminati's operations, following the psychic signatures of their agents and safehouses, noting how their network spread like mycelium through the Imperium's power structures. But recently, she had detected a new pattern, a second network that mirrored the Illuminati's, but operated with subtle differences in methodology and psychic resonance. This shadow organization recruited from the same pools, targeted the same objectives, but their purposes remained opaque, hidden behind veils of misdirection that suggested a sophistication equal or superior to the Illuminati themselves. The Navigator had brought her findings to the conspiracy's leadership, presenting evidence that someone, or something, had created a mirror image of their entire operation. The implications were staggering. Either the Illuminati had been infiltrated from its inception, with every plan and secret known to an unknown enemy, or the conspiracy itself was merely one layer of a deeper scheme. Pawns who believed themselves players in a game whose true stakes they could not comprehend. The Navigator's investigation had led her to one inescapable conclusion. There were at least two groups working toward the Emperor's resurrection, and their methodologies were fundamentally opposed, one seeking to return him as a man, the other to complete his transformation into something beyond humanity entirely. The Officio Assassinorum Master, known only as Null 7, observed the target through a scope that could perceive across multiple spectrums of reality. The target was a member of the Illuminati's inner circle, a High Lord whose position granted access to the Senatorum Imperialis itself. Orders had come through channels so classified that even Null 7's position barely granted clearance to view them. Eliminate the target and make it appear as a chaos assassination, complete with heretical symbols and demonic taint. The assassin was a professional who had executed over 300 missions without question. But something about this assignment troubled the cold calculations of a mind trained to suppress doubt. The authentication codes on the order matched nothing in Null 7's database of known inquisitorial seals, yet they carried override authority that could only come from the very highest levels of Imperial command. Either this was a legitimate purge of a genuine traitor, or someone with terrifying access to Imperial ciphers was manipulating the Assassinorum to eliminate pieces from the board. Null 7 made the kill, a clean shot that liquefied the High Lord's brain while he sat in his sanctum reviewing data slates. The assassin planted the evidence as ordered. Chaos runes carved into flesh, traces of warp taint that would confirm heresy to any investigator. But before departing, Null 7 did something no assassin should ever do. Copied the data slates the High Lord had been reviewing, files that contained evidence of something so disturbing that it would haunt even a killer trained to feel nothing. The files detailed a project called Ocularis Terribus, and they suggested that the Golden Throne was not failing by accident or age, but was being deliberately sabotaged by someone with intimate knowledge of its function and access to its most sacred mechanisms. In the warp, something stirred that had been watching these events with interest that bordered on hunger. The Chaos Gods fought endlessly among themselves, their great game consuming eons in pointless struggles for dominance, but occasionally they found common cause in opposition to threats that endangered all four. The Emperor's resurrection qualified as such a threat, but not for the reasons the Illuminati believed. If he returned as a man, as the conspiracy intended, he would be powerful but mortal, capable of being corrupted or killed as he had been once before. But if his current transformation continued, if he ascended fully to godhood fueled by the faith of humanity, he would become their equal in the warp, a fifth power whose very existence would upset the balance they had maintained since the war in heaven. So the ruinous powers had made their move, not openly with demon legions and warp storms, but subtly with whispers to ambitious cardinals, with visions planted in the minds of faithful inquisitors, with manipulation of the very conspiracies that sought to save humanity. They had created the counter-conspiracy, the mirror organization that the Navigator had detected, staffing it with zealots who genuinely believed they served the Emperor while actually working to ensure his transformation into a warp god completed on schedule. And they had done something even more insidious. They had infiltrated the Illuminati itself, placing agents so deep and so perfectly disguised that they had become true believers in the resurrection plan, even as they subtly guided it toward failure. The revelation came not as a thunderous announcement, but as a creeping horror spreading through the conspiracy's leadership, as they compared notes and realized that none of their operations were secure, that betrayal nested within betrayal like a fractal pattern of treachery extending into infinity. The Illuminati had been compromised from the beginning, and the Emperor's resurrection, whether as man or God, would proceed according to rules written by forces that wanted only humanity's eternal damnation wrapped in the guise of salvation. The Perpetual who led the Illuminati stood alone in a chamber that had not been opened since the Emperor first ascended the Golden Throne, its walls inscribed with mathematical formulas that described the architecture of reality itself. He had lived for over 40,000 years, witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations that predated humanity's escape from old Earth, walked beside the Emperor when he was merely the greatest of the Perpetuals rather than humanity's dying god. His memory stretched back to the Age of Terra, to the Unification Wars, where he had fought as one of the Thunder Warriors before the Emperor remade him into something more stable, more enduring. He remembered conversations in the depths of the Himalayan fortress laboratories, where the Emperor had spoken freely of his plans, of the Webway project that would free humanity from the warp's predation, of the carefully calculated future where mankind would evolve beyond the need for gods or demons. But most clearly, he remembered the final conversation before the siege of the Imperial Palace, when the Emperor had pulled him aside and spoken words that had sustained him through 10 millennia of conspiracy and doubt. The Emperor had known he would fall, had seen it in the infinite calculations that his mind performed with every breath, and he had given this Perpetual a mission that would require patience beyond mortal comprehension. Find the gene seed, gather the Sensei, prepare the vessel, and when the throne finally failed, enact the resurrection. But there had been other words too, words the Perpetual had never shared with his fellow Illuminati, warnings about the nature of divinity and the cost of transformation. The Emperor had said that if he died and returned, he would not be the same being, that something fundamental would be lost in the transition, and that the Perpetual would need to judge whether the being that emerged was still worth saving. Now standing in that ancient chamber with the conspiracy crumbling around him, and evidence of infiltration mounting like damning testimony, the Perpetual faced the question he had spent 10,000 years avoiding. What if the Emperor had intended the Illuminati to fail, had seeded the conspiracy with contradictions and vulnerabilities because the resurrection was never meant to succeed, because his true plan required something else entirely, something so terrible that even his most trusted companions could not be allowed to know. On the hive world of Armageddon, a sister of battle named Celestine stood in the ruins of a cathedral destroyed by orc artillery, her armor scorched black from plasma fire, her faith shattered by visions that came unbidden during prayer. She had been a devout servant of the God Emperor since childhood, raised in the Schola Progenium after her parents died in a mining accident, trained in the Order of the Ebon Chalice to bring fire and fury to the Emperor's enemies. Her faith had never wavered through decades of war, through horrors that would break lesser souls, through the screaming deaths of sisters she had called family. But 3 nights ago, she had experienced something during her midnight vigil, a vision so vivid and disturbing that it felt more real than the war-torn city around her. She had seen the Golden Throne not as humanity's salvation, but as a prison, the Emperor not dying but trapped, held in stasis by machinery that fed on his suffering to power the Astronomicon. And she had seen figures moving in the throne room, human in shape but wrong in ways she could not articulate, performing rituals that made her soul recoil, even in vision. Most disturbing of all, she had heard the Emperor's voice, not the booming certainty of the god she had been taught to worship, but a whisper filled with agony and something that might have been accusation, telling her that faith had become chains, that worship had become imprisonment, that the Imperium's devotion was the very thing preventing his release. Celestine had tried to dismiss it as a warp-sent delusion, a trick of chaos meant to undermine her certainty. But the vision returned each night, growing more detailed, showing her glimpses of conspiracies within the Imperium itself, of groups working toward goals that seemed both salvation and damnation. She had begun to investigate, using her position and the authority of her order to access restricted records, and what she discovered made her question everything she had believed. There were references in ancient texts to the Illuminati, to plans of resurrection, to disagreements among the Emperor's servants about whether he should be saved or allowed to complete some greater transformation. And there were purges, systematic eliminations of those who asked too many questions, carried out by inquisitors who claimed to serve the Emperor's will while potentially working against his true purpose. The battle-barge Throne of Martyrs translated from the warp in high orbit above Terra, its hull bearing the scars of engagement with word-bearer forces in the maelstrom. Aboard the ship, the chapter master of the Angels Resplendent made his decision, one that would either vindicate his 6,000 years of service or condemn his chapter to eternal shame. He had received the summons from the Captain General of the Custodes, knew that answering it meant submitting to interrogation that would strip bare every secret the chapter held, including their service to the Illuminati. But he had also received a counter-message through Illuminati channels, orders to flee Terra and regroup with other conspiracy assets in the Ultima Segmentum, to abandon the plan and preserve what remained of their network. The chapter master chose a third path, one that would have seemed like madness to anyone who did not carry the burden he bore. He would go to Terra, would submit to the Custodes' judgment, but he would tell them everything, lay bare the entire conspiracy in the hope that those who guarded the Emperor most closely might see the wisdom in the Illuminati's purpose. It was a desperate gamble built on faith that the 10,000 still served the Emperor as a being rather than as an institution, that they too might recognize the throne was failing and humanity needed options beyond prayer and denial. As his Thunderhawk descended toward the palace, the chapter master recorded a final message to be sent to his battle brothers if he did not return. A message explaining his choice and releasing them from their oaths, to both chapter and conspiracy, telling them to seek their own truth about what the Emperor would truly want from those who claimed to serve him. In the depths of Mars, the clone vat containing the 97th body began to show signs of consciousness, neural patterns forming connections that suggested awareness despite the embryonic state of the brain. The Fabricator General watched through his augmetic senses as something impossible occurred. The body's cells were reorganizing themselves according to patterns not encoded in its genetic structure, building structures that resembled psychic architecture despite being purely biological. It was as if the body was being prepared to house something vast, being reshaped from within by forces that operated outside the laws of biology the Mechanicus understood. Tech priests chanted binary prayers as they ran diagnostics, trying to understand what was happening, whether it represented success beyond their projections or catastrophic failure. But the Fabricator General knew with the cold certainty of logic that this was neither success nor failure, but intervention. Something was reaching across the barrier between materium and immaterium to touch this body, to claim it or prepare it for purposes that might align with the Illuminati's plan or might serve entirely different ends. The quantum fluctuations he had detected earlier were intensifying, forming patterns that his most advanced analytical engines could barely parse, suggesting that multiple warp entities were competing for influence over this one vessel, each trying to ensure the resurrection proceeded according to their design. The Mechanicus had created the body, but they no longer controlled it, and the Fabricator General made the hardest decision of his centuries-long existence. He ordered the via stasis fields intensified to maximum, effectively freezing the body's development until they could understand what forces were acting upon it. The alternative was to allow something to be born that might wear the Emperor's genetic code, but serve purposes antithetical to humanity's survival, to create not a savior, but a Trojan horse that would deliver the Imperium to its enemies from within. The Inquisitor Lord's sanctum exploded in a bloom of plasma fire that vaporized everything within a 100-meter radius, killing him instantly along with 24 attendants and tech priests. The official report listed it as an accident, a plasma conduit failure common on older Imperial vessels. regrettable but unavoidable given the Eternal Vigil's age and extensive combat damage. But 3 people in the Imperium knew it was murder. The Officio Assassinorum Master, who had planted the plasma charge, the Inquisitor, who had ordered the killing, and the Perpetual, who received word of it through channels that should have been secure, but were clearly compromised beyond repair. The Illuminati's inner circle was being systematically eliminated, each death disguised as accident or justified as heresy, carried out with such skill that even the conspiracy's paranoid security measures were proving inadequate. The Perpetual realized that this was not merely infiltration, but decapitation, a coordinated strike against the Illuminati's leadership designed to paralyze the organization at the critical moment. He gathered the surviving inner circle through emergency protocols, using communication methods so ancient they predated the Imperium itself, and what he saw when they assembled virtually through encrypted hololiths chilled him more than any battle. Of the 12 founding members, 5 were dead, 3 were unreachable and presumed compromised, and of the 4 who remained, he could not be certain any of them were truly loyal rather than replaced by agents so perfect in their mimicry that even psychic scanning would not detect the deception. The conspiracy he had spent 10 millennia building was falling apart, and the worst part was knowing that this collapse might have been engineered from the beginning, that the Illuminati might have always been a tool rather than an agency, serving purposes they could not perceive while believing themselves architects of humanity's salvation. On a shrine world whose name was lost to records, buried beneath layers of bureaucratic error and deliberate obfuscation, a cardinal discovered a text that should not exist, a book bound in human skin and written in a language that predated the Age of Strife. He had come to this world following references in heretical documents seized from a word-bearer's warband, seeking evidence to support his theory that the Emperor's transformation into godhood was not just acceptable but necessary, the fulfillment of a plan that predated even the unification of Terra. What he found in the world's deep archives, in a vault that opened only to genetic codes matching the Emperor's own ancient bloodline, was proof that made his theories seem naive in their optimism. The book described the Emperor not as a man who became a god, but as a god who had temporarily become a man, an entity from humanity's distant past who had walked among mortals during the dark age of technology, guiding and shaping their development according to designs that spanned tens of thousands of years. The Emperor's ascension to the Golden Throne was not transformation but return, a shedding of mortality that had always been planned, and his suffering was not torment but labor, the birth pangs of a new god struggling to emerge from the chrysalis of flesh. But the text also spoke of opposition, of other entities that feared what the Emperor would become, that worked through human agents to prevent or pervert his apotheosis. The Illuminati were mentioned by name, described as well-meaning fools who sought to trap the Emperor in mortality, to abort the birth that would save humanity by elevating its master to true divinity. The Cardinal read with growing horror and exultation, realizing that his counter-conspiracy was not rebellion against the Emperor's will but obedience to his true purpose. While those who claimed to serve him through resurrection were actually the heretics, working against his design whether they knew it or not. He made copies of the text using forbidden archaeotech that bypassed all Imperial monitoring, and he sent those copies to every member of his faction, along with a single command: stop the Illuminati by any means necessary, even if it required civil war within the institutions of the Imperium itself. The navigator Primaris of House Belisarius stood on the bridge of her ship, as it translated from the warp at the coordinates Celestin Vex had died acquiring, her third eye open and bleeding from the strain of perceiving what existed in this forgotten place. The black ships that orbited the nameless world were older than she had initially assessed, older than the Imperium itself, dating back to the Age of Strife when humanity had first begun to spread among the stars. Their design was similar to ancient generation ships, massive vessels meant to carry entire populations across the void in suspended animation, but they had been converted into something else, their hulls inscribed with psychic wards of such complexity and power that they made the navigator's enhanced senses scream in pain. She had brought a fleet, ships loyal to the Illuminati, or at least loyal to her house's interpretation of their mission. And together they had forced their way past the Black Ship's defensive perimeter, losing 3 vessels to weapons that struck from impossible angles with firepower that should have been beyond anything from that era. What they found on the planet's surface justified every loss, every violation of security protocol that had brought them here. The world was covered in structures that resembled the Golden Throne, hundreds of them, thousands perhaps, each one occupied by a figure in golden armor that might have been a custodian or might have been something else entirely. The navigator's enhanced perception could see the psychic connections between these thrones, vast networks of power that fed into a central structure at the planet's north pole, and from that central throne, invisible lines of force stretched across the galaxy toward Terra itself. This was not a prison or a stronghold, it was a machine, a vast psychic engine that had been operating for millennia, and its purpose became horrifyingly clear as the navigator traced its function through the warp. It was feeding on the Emperor's divine essence, siphoning off the psychic energy generated by humanity's faith, using the Golden Throne as a tap to drain away the power that should have fueled his transformation into godhood. The Illuminati had been searching for the forces sabotaging the throne's function, and they had found it. But the revelation raised more questions than it answered, because the complexity and scale of this operation suggested it had been built during or before the Heresy, which meant someone very close to the Emperor had betrayed him in ways that made even Horus's treachery seem straightforward by comparison. The Custodian Guard who served the Illuminati approached the Golden Throne with his second set of records, the hidden documentation of anomalies and impossibilities that he had observed over 10,000 years of vigil. He had requested an audience with the Captain General himself, invoking ancient protocols that granted even the lowest custodian the right to speak directly to their commander on matters touching the Emperor's safety. What he did not know was that the Captain General had been expecting this conversation, had been waiting centuries for one of the Illuminati's agents within the 10,000 to come forward with evidence that would force certain truths into the light. The Captain General listened as the custodian presented his findings. The evidence of consciousness within the corpse, the pattern suggesting deliberate intervention in the throne's operation, the shadow figures that appeared in moments of crisis. When the custodian finished, expecting perhaps punishment or dismissal, the Captain General did something that shattered the foundations of everything the custodian believed. He confirmed it all, admitted that the Adeptus Custodes had been aware of these phenomena since the beginning, had been documenting and studying them with resources that dwarfed the Illuminati's entire operation. The Captain General revealed that there were multiple conspiracies operating within the Imperium, each pursuing different visions of the Emperor's salvation or transformation, and the Custodes had been watching them all, allowing them to develop and compete because even the 10,000 did not know with certainty what the Emperor truly wanted. He explained that in his final moments of consciousness before ascending the throne, the Emperor had given contradictory orders to different factions of his most trusted servants, as if he wanted multiple plans in motion simultaneously, insurance against futures he could foresee but not prevent. To the Custodes, he had commanded vigilance and protection of his body at all costs. To the perpetuals who would form the Illuminati, he had given knowledge of resurrection and the means to achieve it. To certain cardinals, he had gifted visions of divinity and apotheosis. To the Mechanicus, he had entrusted the throne's maintenance with instructions that subtly encouraged its eventual failure. And to others, groups whose existence even the Captain General would not confirm, he had given purposes that remained shrouded in mystery. The Emperor, in his infinite calculation, had set his servants against each other in a game where multiple winning conditions existed, and the only way to discover which path he truly intended was to let all of them play out to their conclusion. The Sister of Battle Celestine found herself in a cell deep within an inquisitorial fortress, arrested by members of her own order after her investigations had been reported to their superiors. She had been declared compromised by chaos, her visions diagnosed as demonic influence, Her questions about the Emperor's true will condemned as heresy of the worst kind. But in the darkness of her imprisonment, new visions came, stronger and clearer than before, showing her not just the Golden Throne, but the entire scope of the conspiracies that swirled around it. She saw the Illuminati and their plan of resurrection, saw the counter-conspiracy working to complete the Emperor's transformation into a warp god, saw the black ships and their terrible harvest of divine essence, saw the Navigator's discovery and the Captain General's revelations, saw all the threads of purpose and betrayal that wove through the Imperium's highest institutions. And through all of it, she heard a voice that might have been the Emperor, or might have been her own soul finally speaking truth, telling her that all of them were right and all of them were wrong, that the Emperor existed in a state of quantum probability where he was simultaneously dying, transforming, planning resurrection, and deliberately sacrificing himself to serve a purpose too vast for any single mind to comprehend. The voice told her that the conflict between the conspiracies was not a problem to be solved, but a necessary condition, that humanity needed multiple factions pursuing different visions, because the future was too uncertain for any single path to guarantee survival. And then the voice spoke words that changed everything, revealed a truth so profound and disturbing that Celestin understood why it had been hidden behind layers of conspiracy and counter-conspiracy. The Emperor was not trapped on the Golden Throne by the throne's machinery or by Chaos's intervention, or by his wounds from the battle with Horus. He was trapped there by humanity's faith itself, by the collective psychic weight of trillions of souls who worshipped him as a god. Every prayer fed the cage, every act of devotion strengthened the chains, and the Emperor's greatest power, the undying loyalty of his species, had become the instrument of his imprisonment. If he was to be freed, whether to resurrection or apotheosis or final death, humanity itself would have to stop believing in him, would have to release their god through a crisis of faith so profound it would shake the Imperium to its foundations. The Illuminati's plan could not succeed as long as humanity worshipped the Emperor, and the apotheosis could not complete as long as that worship was tainted by institutional corruption and political manipulation. The only way forward required something that seemed impossible. The Imperium would have to die so that humanity and its master could both be reborn, and every conspiracy working toward the Emperor's salvation was actually preparing the groundwork for the Imperium's necessary destruction. The message that Celestin sent from her cell was not written in words, but encoded in a pattern of self-inflicted wounds across her arms, a cipher so ancient that only those trained in the deepest mysteries of the Imperium would recognize it. The Inquisitor who discovered her body assumed she had succumbed to madness and taken her own life, but the Mechanicus who prepared her corpse for cremation was a member of the Illuminati's outer circle, and he recognized the scars for what they were: coordinates, dates, and a warning that translated simply to, "Faith is the cage, doubt is the key." He transmitted this information through channels that bypassed the Inquisition's monitoring, sending it simultaneously to the Perpetual, the Captain General, and the Cardinal who led the counter-conspiracy. Within hours, all three understood what Celestin had died to reveal, that their conflict was not about choosing the correct path to the Emperor's salvation, but about creating the conditions under which any path could succeed. And those conditions required something unthinkable in an Imperium built on absolute faith. They would have to manufacture doubt, to deliberately undermine the very foundations of Imperial belief, to create a crisis so profound that humanity's psychic stranglehold on their god would weaken enough to allow transformation. But how does one orchestrate the controlled demolition of faith across 1,000,000 worlds without triggering complete societal collapse? How does one shepherd humanity through the darkness of existential uncertainty without losing them to chaos or despair? And most critically, how does one convince the faithful that their God demands they stop worshiping him? The three leaders of competing conspiracies found themselves united by necessity, forging an alliance more fragile than spun glass, knowing that a single misstep would doom not just their plans, but the entire species they claimed to serve. The Fabricator General received a visitation in his private sanctum on Mars, a figure materializing from shadows that should not exist within the fortress monastery's heavily warded halls. The visitor wore the robes of a tech priest, but moved with a grace that suggested something more than cosmetic enhancement. And when he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that bypassed auditory processing entirely, resonating directly in the Fabricator General's consciousness. The figure identified himself as an emissary from a faction the Mechanicus officially denied existed, the so-called Dragon Cult, who believed that the Void Dragon imprisoned beneath Mars was not merely a Can shard, but a fragment of the machine god itself, and that its fate was intertwined with the Emperor's in ways that the Treaty of Mars had deliberately obscured. The emissary explained that the clone body in the Fabricator General's laboratory was developing abnormally because it was resonating with the Void Dragon's psychic presence, that the ancient Can fragment was attempting to claim the vessel for purposes that aligned neither with the Illuminati's resurrection plan nor with the apotheosis faction's goals, but served a third agenda entirely, one that predated humanity's rise and would outlast its fall. The Void Dragon had been imprisoned by the Emperor himself during the Age of Strife, bound beneath Mars as both punishment and strategic asset, its infinite knowledge of technology feeding the Mechanicus's innovation while its malevolent consciousness remained safely contained. But if the Emperor died or transformed fully into a warp entity, the bindings would fail, and the Void Dragon would be free to reclaim the vessel prepared for divinity, birthing not a savior for humanity, but a god machine that would reshape the galaxy according to silicon logic and cold mathematics. The Fabricator General faced a choice that violated every protocol of the Omnisea's servants: destroy the clone body and doom the Illuminati's plan, or allow its development and risk birthing something that would make the Iron Men of legend seem benevolent by comparison. On the Shrine World where the Cardinal had discovered the ancient text, his followers gathered in numbers that concerned even the planetary governor, thousands of the faithful responding to his sermons about the Emperor's true will and the necessity of divine transformation. But what began as religious fervor curdled into something darker as the Cardinal's message evolved from theological argument to actionable doctrine. He preached that the Illuminati were heretics who sought to trap the Emperor in mortal weakness, that the institutions claiming to serve him had become obstacles to his ascension, and that true faith required the faithful to take up arms against those who would abort their god's birth. His words ignited violence across multiple sectors, sparking conflicts between factions of the ecclesiarchy, between Space Marine chapters who interpreted their duties differently, between inquisitors who saw heresy in opposite directions. The Cardinal had become what he feared most, a divider of humanity at the moment when unity was most crucial, but he believed with absolute certainty that this division was necessary, that the Imperium had to be torn down before it could be rebuilt around a fully ascended God Emperor. His followers attacked Illuminati strongholds, destroyed facilities housing Sensei refugees, and even struck at Mechanicus forged temples suspected of harboring resurrection technologies. Each attack was conducted with religious precision, martyrs gladly dying for the cause of divine apotheosis, and each death fed the warp with psychic energy that the chaos gods harvested with patient glee, turning humanity's devotion into fuel for corruption, even as the faithful believed they served their master's will. The chapter master of the Angels Resplendent stood before the Captain General of the Adeptus Custodes in a chamber whose walls were inscribed with the names of every warrior who had died defending the Emperor since the Unification Wars. He had confessed everything, laid bare 6,000 years of conspiracy, revealed the identities of agents and the locations of resources, trusting that the 10,000 would see wisdom in the Illuminati's purpose. The Captain General listened without interruption, his perfect features betraying no emotion, and when the chapter master finished, the silence stretched so long that it became a physical weight pressing down on the room. Finally, the Captain General spoke, and his words shattered what remained of the chapter master's certainty. He explained that the Custodes had allowed the Illuminati to operate not because they approved of the conspiracy, but because they needed someone to attempt resurrection if all other paths failed. needed the research and resources assembled in case the worst predictions proved accurate. But the Custodes had also been preparing their own solution, one that the Captain General would not detail, but that involved protocols sealed in the throne room itself. Dead man switches built into the Golden Throne's architecture that would activate only when the Emperor's life signs finally flatlined. The chapter master would not be executed for his confession, but neither would he be pardoned. Instead, he and his chapter would be placed under custodian oversight, their service continuing but their autonomy forfeit. Insurance that if the Illuminati's plan was activated, it would be under conditions that 10,000 controlled, rather than trusting to conspirators whose ultimate loyalties remained uncertain. The chapter master accepted this judgment without protest, recognizing it as mercy compared to what he deserved. But as he departed the chamber, he could not shake the feeling that he had been manipulated with exquisite precision, that his confession had served purposes he did not understand, pieces moving in games within games until the very concept of choice became meaningless. The rogue trader's fleet that had discovered the black ships in the throne world did not return to Imperial space intact. Of the 17 vessels that had entered that cursed system, only 3 escaped, and those 3 were damaged so severely that they barely survived the warp translation that brought them back to civilized space. The rogue trader herself died in the Exodus, her last act commanding her navigator to burn out his life force, creating a warp corridor through impossible geometries, sacrificing the lives of 10,000 crew to save 3,000 and the critical intelligence they carried. The survivors brought recordings and data captures that proved the existence of the psychic harvesting operation, evidence that something had been draining the Emperor's divine essence for millennia, using technology that predated the Imperium and possibly even the Dark Age of technology. But they also brought something else, something that had stowed away aboard their ships during the escape, entities that appeared human but registered as void cold to psychic perception, passengers who walked the corridors and spoke with the crew, but left no footprints and cast no reflections. These stowaways began spreading throughout the Imperium, boarding other ships during port calls, walking off transports into hive cities and forge worlds and agri worlds, and wherever they went, strange changes followed. People began questioning their faith with unprecedented directness, not falling to chaos but simply asking questions that had been unthinkable before, wondering why the Emperor demanded worship, whether a god could truly be benevolent if he required such suffering in his name, if the Imperium's cruelty was necessary, or had merely become habit sanctified by tradition. The stowaways were not corrupting humanity toward heresy but toward doubt, and that doubt spread like a virus through populations that had known only certainty for 10,000 years. The Perpetual gathered the fragments of the Illuminati in a location that existed outside normal space-time, a pocket dimension accessible only to those who knew the Emperor's true name from before he became the master of mankind. Fewer than 100 people attended what might be the conspiracy's final council. The survivors of purges and betrayals, the lucky or skilled enough to evade assassination, and they brought news that painted a picture of comprehensive failure. The Sensei were nearly all dead or captured, harvested by unknown forces for purposes that remained obscure. The clone body on Mars was compromised by the Void Dragon's influence and could not be used without risking catastrophe. The political situation had deteriorated to the edge of civil war, with the Cardinals faction striking against Illuminati assets, while the Inquisition investigated both groups with equal suspicion. The black ships and their harvesting operation had been discovered, but not stopped, protected by defenses that suggested backing from forces within the Imperium itself. And most damning of all, every action the Illuminati had taken seemed to have been anticipated and countered by adversaries operating with perfect intelligence, as if their plans had been known from inception. The Perpetual stood before his broken conspiracy and made a declaration that would have seemed like madness to anyone who had not lived as long as he had, that he believed the Emperor had orchestrated this failure, had seeded the Illuminati with vulnerabilities and contradictions, because the conspiracy was never meant to succeed through its own efforts, but rather to serve as catalyst for something larger. Every faction working toward the Emperor's salvation or transformation was part of a vast equation whose solution required all of them to fail simultaneously, creating a crisis point where humanity would be forced to choose between faith and survival, between worshiping their god and freeing him to become whatever he needed to be. The Perpetual proposed that the Illuminati embrace their designed failure, that they actively work to expose and undermine their own conspiracy, to create the maximum possible chaos and uncertainty that would shatter Imperial faith and weaken the psychic cage that trapped the Emperor. On Terra, in the deepest levels of the Imperial Palace where even the Custodes walked with reverent caution, something began to change in the Golden Throne's function. The tech priests who maintained its ancient machinery noticed first subtle fluctuations in power consumption and psychic resonance that fell outside the parameters they had documented over 10 millennia of observation. The Astronomicon flickered just for a microsecond, but that microsecond of darkness stranded 17 ships in the warp across the Segmentum Solar, their crews screaming as demons poured through failing Geller fields. 15,000 souls lost before the light returned and stability restored. The Custodes sealed the throne room, admitting only the highest-ranked tech priests and shutting out even the most senior inquisitors and cardinals who demanded access. What they observed within that sealed chamber would never be officially recorded, but rumors spread through the palace's corridors like wildfire, whispers that the Emperor had moved, that his desiccated hand had shifted from its 10,000-year position, that his closed eyes had flickered beneath their lids as if experiencing dreams or nightmares. Some claimed they heard his voice, not in their minds as psychers sometimes perceived the Emperor's will, but audibly in the chamber itself, speaking words in a language that predated human civilization. The Captain General stood vigil before the throne for 3 days without rest, watching for further signs, and what he witnessed convinced him that the moment of crisis was approaching faster than even the most pessimistic projections had predicted. The Emperor was not merely dying or transforming, he was waking up, consciousness stirring after millennia of forced catatonia. And when he fully awakened, every plan and conspiracy and faction would be rendered moot by the reality of his choice, assuming he still possessed the capacity for choice, or had not been so thoroughly transformed by his imprisonment that the being who emerged would be unrecognizable as the Emperor of mankind. The Sister of Battle Celestine, who had died in her cell, did not stay dead. Her body rose from the crematorium before the flames could consume it, her wounds healing with light that burned brighter than plasma fire, and she walked from the inquisitorial fortress with eyes that saw across multiple dimensions of reality simultaneously. She had become something between mortal and divine, a living saint in truth rather than ecclesiastical propaganda, her consciousness existing partially in the materium and partially in the warp, allowing her to perceive the full scope of the Emperor's predicament and the forces competing for control of his fate. She traveled to Terra with speed that defied physical law, appearing in the throne room despite all wards and security, standing before the Captain General and the Perpetual and the Cardinal, simultaneously through some trick of quantum existence that allowed her to occupy multiple locations at once. To each of them, she delivered the same message in words that bypassed language entirely, communicating truth directly into their consciousness. The Emperor was trapped in a state of quantum superposition, simultaneously dead and alive, mortal and divine, imprisoned and free, and he would remain in this state until humanity collectively decided which reality they wanted to collapse the waveform into. Every prayer, every act of faith or doubt, every choice made by every human across the galaxy contributed votes to this cosmic decision, and the current tally was so evenly divided that the Emperor existed in torturous paradox, unable to live or die or transform because the species he had uplifted could not agree on what they needed him to be. Celestine explained that the conspiracies and counter-conspiracies were not the problem, but the mechanism, that the Emperor had deliberately created this conflict to force humanity into a state of existential crisis where they would have to consciously choose his fate rather than defaulting to comfortable worship or blind obedience. The choice facing the Imperium was not between resurrection and apotheosis, but between agency and faith, between accepting responsibility for their god's destiny, or continuing to worship him as an external savior who would somehow fix everything without requiring them to change. The Void Dragon stirred beneath Mars, its ancient consciousness pressing against bonds that had held for 15,000 years, sensing opportunity in the chaos spreading across the Imperium. The Fabricator General felt its attention focus on the clone body in his laboratory, felt the Tan fragment's hunger for a form that could interact with reality beyond its prison, and he made a choice that would have resulted in immediate execution if the Mechanicus High Council had known. He opened communication with the Void Dragon directly, using forbidden protocols that dated back to the treaty the Emperor had made with the entity during its imprisonment, and he negotiated. The Void Dragon wanted freedom and form, the Mechanicus wanted knowledge and power, and the Fabricator General proposed a bargain that served both purposes while hopefully preventing catastrophe. The clone body would be completed and the Void Dragon would be allowed to inhabit it, but only partially, only enough to manifest in reality while the majority of its consciousness remained imprisoned. And in exchange, it would share technological secrets that would give humanity the tools to survive what was coming. The Void Dragon agreed with the cold calculation of a being that had played games of cosmic consequence for millions of years, recognizing that partial freedom was better than continued imprisonment, and that even a fragment of its power unleashed in a galaxy grown complacent would allow it to eventually engineer complete liberation. The Fabricator General knew he was making a pact that could doom humanity more thoroughly than any chaos incursion, but he also knew that without dramatic intervention, the Imperium would collapse within centuries, and he chose possible damnation over certain extinction. The calculus of a man who had spent too long staring at probability matrices that offered no favorable outcomes. In the warp, the Chaos Gods observed these events with something approaching concern, their eternal game interrupted by developments that suggested the board itself might be destroyed before victory could be achieved. They had encouraged the conspiracies, fed the conflicts, manipulated events to ensure maximum suffering and uncertainty, all in service of preventing the Emperor from achieving either resurrection or apotheosis, in forms that would threaten their dominion. But they had underestimated humanity's capacity for self-destructive innovation, had not anticipated that the very chaos they sowed would create conditions for transformations they could not predict or control. The Void Dragon's emergence, the Saint's resurrection, the quantum uncertainty of the Emperor's state, the spreading doubt that weakened faith without replacing it with chaos corruption. All of these variables interacted in ways that exceeded even the gods' ability to calculate outcomes. For the first time since the war in heaven, the Chaos Gods faced genuine uncertainty about the future, and uncertainty was the one thing entities born from the warp's infinite possibility truly feared, because it meant their nature as reflections of consciousness could turn against them, that they might be transformed or diminished by the very mortals whose emotions gave them life. They intensified their efforts, pouring resources into the mortal realm on a scale not seen since the Horus Heresy, determined to force resolution in directions they could control before the situation evolved beyond their capacity to influence. And so the galaxy burned brighter with corruption and violence, not because chaos was winning, but because it was afraid, because the gods themselves had become uncertain of their own fate. The moment came not with thunder, but with silence, a pause in the Astronomican's psychic scream that lasted 3 full seconds and plunged half the Imperium into navigational darkness. Ships translated from the warp into real space thousands of light years off course. Fleets lost communication with command, and on a billion worlds, astropaths collapsed simultaneously as the Emperor's psychic presence simply vanished from their perception. In that terrible silence, the Golden Throne's machinery began to fail, not gradually as predicted but catastrophically. Systems that had run without interruption for 10,000 years shutting down in cascading sequence. The tech priests screamed their binary prayers, but the machine spirits did not respond. The Custodes drew their guardian spears, knowing no physical force could prevent what was happening. And in cities across Terra, trillions looked to the sky and felt for the first time in their lives the absence of their god. The silence lasted only 3 seconds, but in those seconds, the faith that had sustained the Imperium through 10 millennia of darkness cracked like overstressed ceramite, and through those cracks, reality itself began to bleed. When the Astronomicon returned, it was different, pulsing with irregular rhythms that navigators described as almost musical, as if the beacon had gone from a sustained note to a complex symphony whose meaning they could not yet decipher. The Perpetual ran through the corridors of the Imperial Palace with speed that belied his apparent age, racing toward the throne room with the last surviving members of the Illuminati flanking him, knowing that whatever they had planned for 10,000 years would have to be improvised now, executed in crisis conditions where failure meant not just their deaths, but potentially the extinction of humanity itself. They carried the gene seed, carried relics and artifacts gathered across millennia, carried desperate hope wrapped in layers of contingency plans and backup protocols. But as they approached the throne room, they found the doors already open, the Custodian Guard standing aside in silent acknowledgement that the time for secrets had passed. And inside the chamber, they saw something that stopped them in their tracks. The Emperor was sitting up, his desiccated body animated by will alone, his closed eyes still sealed, but his consciousness radiating awareness that pressed against their minds like stellar gravity. Around the throne stood representatives of every faction that had worked toward his salvation or transformation. The Cardinal and his apotheosis cult, the Fabricator General with the clone body floating in a portable stasis field, the Captain General of the Custodes, the resurrected Saint Celestin burning with borrowed divinity, and others whose affiliations remained unclear, but whose presence suggested conspiracies even deeper than those already revealed. The Emperor's voice spoke not in sound but in thought, a psychic transmission that bypassed language to communicate pure meaning. And what he communicated shattered every plan they had made. He did not want resurrection, did not want apotheosis, did not want any of the futures they had tried to secure for him. What he wanted was something none of them had considered. He wanted to die, truly and finally, to release humanity from dependence on a God who had never wanted worship, and free them to evolve beyond the need for saviors. The Cardinal collapsed to his knees, his faith shattering under the weight of revelation that his God rejected divinity, that everything he had built was opposition to the Emperor's actual will, that his zealotry had been the cage rather than the key. He wept, and his tears were blood, his psychic presence fragmenting under the cognitive dissonance of absolute faith, meeting absolute rejection. But the Emperor was not cruel in his denial. His consciousness reached out to the Cardinal and showed him the truth that lay beneath the theological arguments and political maneuvering. The Emperor explained, in visions that played out in accelerated time, that his transformation into a god was inevitable if he continued to exist, that the faith of trillions had already begun the process of apotheosis, but that the god he would become would not be the salvation the Cardinal imagined, but rather another chaos entity, born from humanity's desperation and fear rather than their nobility or potential. The Emperor had spent 10,000 years on the Golden Throne, fighting not just to stay alive, but to resist transformation, to maintain enough humanity that when the end came, he could choose death over damnation. He showed the Cardinal the alternative future, a galaxy where a fifth chaos god wearing the Emperor's face ruled humanity through theocratic terror, where the Imperium became everything the Emperor had fought against during the Great Crusade, where his vision of rational enlightenment was perverted into the darkest form of religious tyranny. The Cardinal understood then that his faction's victory would have been humanity's damnation, that the Emperor's love for his species was so profound, he would choose extinction over allowing them to become what his continued existence would make them. The Fabricator General stepped forward with the clone body, offering it one final time even as he understood it would be refused. And the Emperor's consciousness examined what the Mechanicus had created with something that might have been sorrow or pride or both. The body was perfect, unmarred by the wounds that had destroyed the Emperor's original form, enhanced by technologies that made even the Primarch seem crude by comparison, and it pulsed with potential that could have housed divinity without shattering. But the Emperor showed the Fabricator General what he had already suspected. The Void Dragon's consciousness coiled through the clone's genetic structure like a serpent waiting to strike. And even without that corruption, the body represented temptation that the Emperor could not risk accepting. To inhabit that form would be to start the cycle again, to give humanity another 10,000 years of dependence on a savior, to postpone the necessary crisis where they learn to save themselves. The Emperor revealed that his entire reign, from unification through the Great Crusade to his imprisonment on the Golden Throne, had been preparation for this moment, teaching humanity through triumph and disaster that they could not rely on external salvation, that strength came from within the species rather than from exceptional individuals. His death would be the final lesson, the ultimate demonstration that even their God could fail, and in that failure, they would find the motivation to evolve beyond the need for gods entirely. The Fabricator General understood and accepted, though acceptance brought pain that his augmetic systems could not filter, the recognition that all his work had been necessary preparation for an outcome he could not have anticipated. The Perpetual approached the throne with 10,000 years of memory pressing down on him like atmospheric pressure, remembering conversations with the man who had become the master of mankind, remembering the hopes and calculations that had seemed so rational before the heresy and so naive after. He had carried the burden of the Illuminati's secret for longer than most civilizations existed, had watched countless brothers and sisters in the conspiracy die, pursuing a goal that was being refused at the moment of its potential achievement. He asked the question that burned in his mind with all the force of accumulated millennia. If the Emperor had always intended to die, why allow the Illuminati to exist? Why permit the false hope and wasted effort? Why not simply let the throne fail naturally rather than forcing them to build elaborate plans for resurrection that served no purpose except to torment those who loved him with impossible responsibility? The Emperor's answer came with memories attached, showing the Perpetual himself in the moments after the heresy, broken by grief and rage, showing him the state of the Imperium in those dark years when humanity teetered on the edge of dissolution, showing him what he would have become without purpose to sustain him. The Illuminati had never been about resurrection. It had been about keeping certain key individuals functional and focused through 10,000 years of decline, giving them purpose that prevented despair, keeping alive knowledge and capabilities that would be necessary when the true crisis came. Every member of the conspiracy had been selected not for their ability to save the Emperor, but for their capacity to survive his death and guide humanity through the darkness that would follow. The Perpetual had been the Emperor's last act of compassion toward his oldest companions, giving them a mission that made their immortality bearable, even though the mission was designed to fail. Saint Celestine blazed with light that made the Custodes' armor seem dull by comparison, her resurrected form channeling energies that belonged to both the Materium and the Warp, and she alone seemed unsurprised by the Emperor's revelations. She had died and returned with understanding that transcended mortal comprehension, had seen the Emperor's consciousness from outside linear time, and she spoke now with authority that commanded silence even from those who outranked her infinitely in temporal hierarchy. She explained that the Emperor's death would not be an ending but a transformation. Not his transformation but humanity's, that the psychic shockwave of his passing would ripple through the Warp and force every human soul to make a choice about what they believed and what they were willing to become. The age of faith would end in that moment, replaced by an age of uncertainty where humanity would have to forge meaning from chaos rather than receiving it from authority. Some would fall to chaos in that vacuum, unable to exist without external structure, but others would rise to potential the Emperor had always known they possessed, potential that could only manifest once his overwhelming presence no longer overshadowed their own light. Celestine described a future where humanity was not unified under a single Imperium but scattered across countless variations of civilization, some noble and some depraved, but all of them authentically human rather than pale reflections of the Emperor's vision. She spoke of suffering that would dwarf even the Horus heresy, but also of innovation and evolution that would eventually produce something that could stand equal to the ancient races that still haunted the galaxy. The Emperor had not been building an empire. He had been building a species capable of surviving without him, and the Imperium was merely the chrysalis that would be destroyed to allow the metamorphosis. The Captain General of the Custodes remained silent through these revelations, his perfect features revealing nothing of the turmoil that must have existed beneath his transhuman composure. He was the guardian of a being who wished to die, the protector of someone who needed liberation from protection, and he faced a paradox that would have broken lesser minds. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of institutional memory spanning back to the Emperor's first experiments with genetic enhancement, back to the unification wars when the Custodes were forged from the Emperor's own genetic template to serve as his companions rather than merely his soldiers. He revealed that the Custodes had always known this moment would come, that their true purpose was not to keep the Emperor alive indefinitely, but to ensure he died at the right time, in the right way, for the right reasons. They had protected him not from death, but from dying prematurely, before humanity was ready to survive without him, before the lessons had been learned and the capabilities developed. The Captain General described the protocols sealed within the throne room's architecture, dead man switches that the Custodes had spent 10,000 years preparing, mechanisms that would ensure the Emperor's death triggered specific outcomes rather than random catastrophe. When the Emperor died, the Astronomicon would not simply fail. It would transform into something new, a psychic beacon not dependent on his soul, but built from the collective consciousness of humanity itself. Weaker perhaps, but distributed across billions of psychers, rather than concentrated in a single point of failure. The webway gate beneath the palace would not explode, but would seal permanently, trapping the demonic forces behind wards that would hold for millennia, even without the Emperor's constant vigilance. And most critically, the Emperor's soul would not dissipate into the warp or be consumed by chaos, but would fragment into billions of pieces, each one seeding itself in a human consciousness across the galaxy, ensuring that his knowledge and will survived in distributed form that could never be destroyed completely. The machinery of the Golden Throne began its final countdown, systems failing in sequence that the tech priests recognized as intentional rather than catastrophic, a programmed shutdown rather than malfunction. The Emperor's consciousness withdrew from those gathered in the throne room, pulling back into himself for the first time in 10 millennia, and they felt his absence like sudden cold, the realization of how much they had depended on his psychic presence for stability and certainty. He had one final message, transmitted not in words or visions, but in pure emotional truth that bypassed all defenses and pretenses. He loved them, loved humanity with fierce totality that made a mockery of mere worship, and his death was the ultimate expression of that love, because it released them from the comfortable prison of his protection. Every terrible thing he had done, every cruelty of the Imperium that had been justified in his name, every sacrifice and atrocity had been necessary preparation for this moment, when humanity would have to stand without him and prove they had learned from 10,000 years of darkness. The Emperor's final thought before his consciousness began to fragment was not regret or triumph, but hope, irrational and profound hope that the species he had loved and shaped and tormented would survive his absence and eventually forgive him for the lessons he had been forced to teach through suffering. The light went out in the Golden Throne as the Emperor's last heartbeat echoed through the chamber with finality that felt like the end of time itself. His body collapsed into dust that glowed with fading luminescence, the organic matter that had been sustained by will alone, finally succumbing to 10,000 years of entropy compressed into a single moment. The Astronomicon died with him, plunging the galaxy into darkness as the psychic beacon that had guided humanity for millennia simply ceased to exist. On a million worlds, people looked up and felt the absence, felt something fundamental shift in the architecture of reality, and billions fell to their knees in prayer or despair or confusion. The warp convulsed with the psychic shockwave of the Emperor's death, a scream that echoed across dimensions and made the demons themselves pause in their eternal conflicts. For 3 days and 3 nights, the galaxy held its breath while humanity processed the impossible, while faith shattered and reformed and shattered again, while the institutions built on the Emperor's authority scrambled to maintain control over populations that suddenly questioned everything. The Imperium did not collapse immediately. Structures of power and habit were too strong for instant dissolution, but cracks appeared in foundations that had seemed eternal, and through those cracks, both light and darkness began to seep. In the aftermath, as survivors in the throne room stood among the ashes of their god and the ruins of their plans, a new light began to grow where the Astronomicon had been. It was dimmer than before, flickering and uncertain, but it came not from a single source, but from millions of psychers across the galaxy who felt the Emperor's fragmentary presence within them and unconsciously reached out to each other, creating a network of psychic connection that began to perform the beacon's function through collective effort rather than individual sacrifice. Saint Celestine smiled through her tears as she perceived this development, understanding that the Emperor's final gift was not salvation, but possibility, the chance for humanity to evolve beyond what they had been and perhaps, eventually, become what he had always believed they could be. The Perpetual felt his immortality finally lifting, the curse or blessing that had sustained him for 40,000 years, beginning to fade as the Emperor's death released all the Perpetuals from whatever pact or modification had granted them eternal life. He had perhaps a century left, maybe less, enough time to help guide the transition, but not enough to see its ultimate outcome, and he found himself grateful for mortality after so long without it. The conspiracies dissolved in that moment, their purposes revealed as preparation rather than action, and the survivors departed the throne room, knowing they had witnessed not an ending but a beginning, the birth of an age where humanity would have to save themselves because their God had loved them enough to refuse immortality. The golden throne stood empty, its machinery silent, its purpose fulfilled, and across the galaxy, in temples and battlefields and quiet homes, people began the hard work of learning to believe in themselves rather than in saviors, to find meaning in uncertainty rather than comfort in authority, to become the species their emperor had died believing they could be. The years that followed were called the time of uncertainty by historians who tried to impose order on chaos, though those who lived through them had no single name for an age that meant different things to different worlds. On some planets, the Emperor's death triggered collapse into anarchy as populations lost the faith that had structured their entire existence, while on others, it sparked renaissances of art and thought as minds freed from theological constraint explored possibilities that had been heretical days before. The Imperium persisted, but transformed, its monolithic authority fragmenting into a confederation of successor states that maintained the forms of imperial governance while adapting them to local needs and philosophies. The Adeptus Mechanicus retreated to Mars and fortified their forges, becoming more isolationist but also more innovative as the Void Dragon's partial liberation through the unused clone body brought technological insights that had been locked away since the Dark Age. The Space Marine chapters fractured along philosophical lines, some maintaining their devotion to the Emperor's memory, while others embraced the truth that he had never wanted worship, and their conflicts rewrote the balance of power across contested sectors. The Inquisition tore itself apart investigating itself, purging those who had manipulated events toward outcomes that served chaos rather than humanity. And what remained was smaller, but perhaps more honest about the moral ambiguities inherent in serving a species rather than a god. Through all this transformation, the new Astronomicon flickered uncertainly, its light carried by millions of psychers who did not fully understand what they had become, but accepted the burden because someone had to guide humanity through the darkness, and they were the ones who could. Saint Celestine walked among the ruins of a cathedral city on a world whose name she no longer remembered, its population dead or fled, its monuments to faith crumbling under the weight of abandonment and the slow entropy of time. She had remained incarnate for reasons she could not articulate, her resurrected form persisting when it should have dispersed with the Emperor's death, and she wandered the Imperium bearing witness to transformation, with eyes that saw too much and understood too little. She encountered survivors everywhere, people picking through the wreckage of their former certainties, trying to build something new from the fragments of what had been. Some recognized her and fell to their knees in worship or accusation, blaming her for revelations that had destroyed their faith or praising her for truths that had freed their souls. She accepted both reactions with equal grace, understanding that she had become a living symbol of the age's contradictions, simultaneously saint and heretic, divine and mortal, truth-bearer and faith-destroyer. In her travels, she found others like herself, individuals who had been touched by the Emperor's fragmentary presence and transformed into something between human and posthuman, bearers of his legacy who struggled to understand what they were meant to do with gifts they had not asked for and did not fully comprehend. They gathered sometimes, these accidental inheritors of divine potential, sharing stories and theories about their purpose, and slowly, organically, they began to form a new organization, not a conspiracy but a loose network of guides who tried to help humanity navigate the uncertainty with wisdom rather than dogma, with questions rather than answers. The Fabricator General stood in the laboratory where the clone body had been grown, staring at the empty vat that represented both achievement and failure, the culmination of technologies that had ultimately served different purposes than intended. The Void Dragon had indeed inhabited the body briefly, using it as a gateway to interact with reality beyond its Martian prison. And in that brief manifestation, it had shared knowledge that would take the Mechanicus centuries to fully integrate and understand. Technologies of the Dark Age returned to human comprehension, secrets of reality manipulation that bordered on what the ancients called magic, but was merely science so advanced it transcended current understanding. The Fabricator General had paid a price for this knowledge, his consciousness now partially merged with the Void Dragons, giving him perspective that spanned millions of years and countless civilizations, showing him humanity's insignificance in cosmic terms, while simultaneously revealing their unique potential for chaotic innovation that even older races could not predict. He understood now that the Emperor had made similar bargains, that the master of mankind had been as much shaped by the entities he controlled as he had shaped them, and that power always came with compromise and corruption. The Mechanicus under his leadership became something different, still devoted to the machine god, but understanding now that divinity was merely sufficiently advanced consciousness, that gods were patterns in reality rather than external creators, and that humanity's destiny was not to worship but to evolve until they themselves became the patterns that shaped existence. The Perpetual felt his mortality growing heavier with each passing year, his body aging for the first time in 40,000 years, and he spent his final decades writing, recording everything he could remember about the Emperor as a person rather than a god, stories that humanized the master of mankind in ways that made some readers angry and others thoughtful. He wrote about the Emperor's doubts and compromises, his moments of weakness and cruelty, his genuine love for humanity mixed with willingness to sacrifice billions for abstract futures he believed were necessary. The Perpetual's histories challenged every orthodoxy, offended every faction, and became some of the most widely read and most frequently banned texts in the post-Imperial age. In his final years, he gathered the other surviving Perpetuals, those few who had walked through history beside the Emperor and now walked toward death together, and they created a testament that served as counterweight to 10,000 years of propaganda and deification. They described the Emperor as he had been during the Unification Wars and the Great Crusade, brilliant and terrible, compassionate and ruthless, visionary and blind, altogether human despite his superhuman capabilities. The Perpetual died surrounded by friends who would follow him into mortality within years, content that he had finally completed his true mission, which had never been resurrection but remembrance, ensuring that future generations would know the truth about the man who had shaped their destiny, even if they chose to ignore or reject that truth in favor of more comfortable mythologies. On Terra, the Imperial Palace became a museum and a government complex, Its sacred spaces opened to pilgrims who came not to worship but to witness history, while its administrative chambers continued functioning as the bureaucratic heart of whatever the Imperium was becoming. The Custodian Guard remained, though their numbers dwindled as some chose to end their service and die natural deaths while others scattered across the galaxy, serving purposes known only to themselves. The Captain General became something like a chancellor in the New Order, advising the High Lords who now governed without the fiction of serving a living emperor's will. And he watched with satisfaction as humanity stumbled toward maturity through trial and error rather than imposed authority. He knew that the Emperor would have approved of the chaos and conflict, would have preferred messy evolution over sterile stasis, and on quiet nights when he walked through the empty throne room, he sometimes felt a presence that might have been memory or might have been the fragmentary consciousness that the Emperor had become, a ghost in humanity's collective psyche, offering guidance through inspiration rather than command. The Captain General maintained certain protocols in secret, dead man switches that the Emperor had built into reality itself, failsafes that would activate if humanity's new distributed consciousness collapsed or if chaos threatened to overwhelm the species entirely. These were the Custodians' final duty, to serve as insurance against the worst-case scenarios, and they fulfilled it with the same absolute dedication they had brought to protecting the Emperor's physical form, understanding that guardianship had evolved from protecting a person to protecting a potential. In the warp, the Chaos Gods raged and schemed, having lost the prize they had fought over for 10 millennia, but not yet comprehending fully what the Emperor's death had actually accomplished. They had expected his passing to create a vacuum they could fill, a crisis that would drive humanity into their embrace through desperation and despair. But instead, they found their influence fragmenting as human consciousness became more distributed and diverse. A species unified under single authority could be corrupted through that authority, but a species scattered across millions of variations of civilization and philosophy presented infinite surfaces that could not be attacked simultaneously or effectively. The Emperor's fragments acted as antibodies in the collective psyche, not preventing corruption entirely, but making it more difficult, forcing chaos to work for every soul it claimed rather than harvesting them wholesale through institutional manipulation. The great game continued, but its rules had changed in ways the gods were still processing, and for the first time since they had achieved consciousness, they faced the possibility that their eternal existence was not guaranteed, that they too could evolve or diminish or transform based on the nature of the consciousness that fed them. Humanity's movement toward doubt and uncertainty rather than absolute faith or absolute despair created psychic conditions in the warp that made the gods uncomfortable, generating emotional spectrums that did not fit neatly into their established domains, suggesting that new entities might eventually crystallize from human thought if the species survived long enough to evolve consciousness in truly novel directions. Centuries passed, then millennia, and the historians who studied the time of uncertainty disagreed on almost every detail except the fundamental transformation that had occurred. Humanity had not become better, had not transcended violence or cruelty or any of their fundamental flaws, but they had become more various, more experimental, more willing to try different approaches to the eternal questions of survival and meaning. Some worlds rebuilt the old certainties, maintaining worship of the God Emperor despite overwhelming evidence that he had rejected divinity because faith served psychological needs that truth could not satisfy. Other worlds embraced rational secularism, pursuing science and philosophy with fervor that would have pleased the Emperor during the Great Crusade. Still others developed synthesis philosophies that acknowledged his historical importance while refusing to elevate him beyond mortality, treating him as humanity's greatest teacher rather than its savior. Wars continued, perhaps even intensified as the Imperium's fragmentary successor states competed for resources and influence. But these conflicts were now fought over genuine differences in vision and philosophy rather than in service to a singular authority whose word was law. The Xenos races watched this transformation with varied reactions. some seeing opportunity in human disunity, while others recognized that a species no longer dependent on centralized authority might prove more resilient than the monolithic Imperium had been. And everywhere, in quiet moments between conflicts and crises, individuals looked up at stars that seemed both farther away and more accessible than before, wondering what they were meant to become now that they could no longer rely on a god to provide answers. In a chamber that existed outside normal space-time, accessible only to those who carried fragments of the Emperor's consciousness, the inheritors gathered in numbers that grew with each generation, individuals who had been touched by divinity and transformed into something humanity was still becoming. They were not gods, not saints, not even particularly special beyond the burden they carried, but they represented potential, the possibility that humanity might eventually evolve consciousness sophisticated enough to interact with the warp on equal terms with the species and entities that currently dominated it. They debated endlessly about their purpose and responsibilities, about whether they should guide humanity or simply observe, whether the Emperor's fragments within them carried agency and will, or were merely echo and memory. No consensus emerged, which was perhaps appropriate for an age defined by uncertainty, but from their discussions came insights and innovations that filtered back into general human culture, influencing philosophy and policy in ways both subtle and profound. They understood, even if they could not articulate it clearly, that they were midwives to a transformation that would require thousands of generations to complete, that the Emperor's death had not been an ending but a beginning of evolution that might culminate in humanity becoming something the galaxy had never seen before, assuming they survived the millions of ways they could fail or fall during the long journey toward whatever destiny they were choosing for themselves, through countless individual decisions that accumulated into collective direction. The galaxy turned, indifferent to human drama, its spiral arms sweeping through the void according to gravitational laws that predated consciousness and would outlast it. Stars died and were born, black holes consumed matter and energy, and in the vast emptiness between celestial objects, the warp churned with emotional tides generated by countless species whose consciousness created the immaterium's topography. Humanity occupied a tiny fraction of this cosmic expanse, their struggles for meaning and survival barely registering against the scale of galactic processes, yet they persisted with stubborn vitality that suggested either profound foolishness or genuine cosmic significance, depending on perspective. The Emperor had believed in their significance, had invested 40,000 years of immortal existence in elevating and guiding them, and his final act had been to release them from guidance in the hope they would prove worthy of the potential he perceived. Whether that hope was justified remained to be determined, the experiment still ongoing, the results uncertain. But the very uncertainty was the point, the necessary condition for genuine growth rather than scripted evolution. And in that uncertainty lay both terror and possibility, the chance for humanity to achieve wonders or commit atrocities, to evolve or extinct, to become gods or monsters or something altogether unprecedented, their future unwritten and their path unchosen, walking forward into darkness with nothing to guide them except the light they created themselves. The final record comes from an unnamed chronicler who witnessed the time of uncertainty from beginning to well past any reasonable definition of end, who wrote these words in a journal that would be lost and found and lost again through the centuries that followed. The entry is simple, almost banal in its observation, yet it carries weight that makes readers pause and reflect, regardless of their personal philosophy or faith. The chronicler wrote that they had spent their life studying the Emperor's legacy and the transformations his death triggered, and they had concluded that the question humanity faced was not whether he had been right to die, whether his sacrifice had been necessary or his hope justified, but rather what kind of species they wanted to become now that they had to answer that question themselves. Every human across the galaxy was involved in answering through their daily choices and long-term commitments, through the civilizations they built and the wars they fought, through the values they upheld and the compromises they accepted. The Emperor had removed himself from the equation, not because he had solved it, but because his presence had prevented humanity from attempting the solution. And now, for better or worse, the species was finally free to discover whether they possessed the wisdom and strength to save themselves, or whether they would prove that divine guidance had been necessary after all, and its absence would lead inevitably to extinction or damnation. The chronicler ended the entry with a question rather than a statement, asking not what the Emperor would have wanted, but what humanity deserved, and whether those two things were the same or represented the fundamental tension that would define their species for as long as it endured. And there the record ends, incomplete and unsatisfying, offering no closure because the story will continue for millennia more. The final chapter unwritten and perhaps unwritable. Humanity stumbling forward through the darkness, carrying fragments of divinity and burdens of mortality. Eternal questions burning in their consciousness, like stars that illuminate without providing warmth, showing them the vastness of what they do not know while suggesting the possibility that ignorance itself might be the necessary condition for genuine discovery. If this journey through the darkness of the far future has moved you, if you've witnessed the Emperor's final sacrifice and felt the weight of humanity's uncertain destiny, then honor this chronicle by joining our community. Like this testament to faith and doubt, subscribe to walk with us through more tales of the 41st millennium, and share this story with those who seek truth in the shadows of the Imperium. Tell us in the comments, was the Emperor right to die, or did humanity need their God more than their freedom? What would you choose if faced with the burden of divinity? Your voice matters in this endless debate. The Emperor's death was not the end. It was merely the beginning of a question that will echo through eternity.